The 23rd of August is National Sponge Cake Day. When I think sponge cake, I think of Victoria Sponge. It's a quintessential part of afternoon tea. Let's talk about that over a cuppa.
Sponge, 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 sponge. Sponge, 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 sponge.
Victoria Sponge Cake, or Victoria Sandwich Cake as some call it, is a 2-layer sponge cake most commonly filled with raspberry jam and freshly whipped cream. It's then dusted with either caster sugar or icing sugar. There are many schools of thought when it comes to this dessert. Some prepare it all in one step, the butter, the sugar, the eggs, and the self-raising flour, all in one bowl and mixed. It's then divided between 2 pans and baked. Others take a different approach to the sponge, creaming the butter and sugar together, adding the eggs, and folding in the self-raising flour. There are still yet others that whip the eggs separately for an even lighter volume to the final product. Today I'm going to focus on the first 2 aforementioned techniques. I will prepare one using the all-at-once method, and one with the creaming method of the butter, sugar, and then adding the eggs and the flour. Although Queen Victoria was known for having varieties of sweets at her afternoon tea table, it was the sweet and simple sponge cake that reigned supreme on her table above all others. As the recipe evolved with the invention of baking powder, there's no surprise that the sponge cake was renamed in honour of its royal patron. Of course, today there are innumerable debates over the best preparation method, what flavour of jam to use, or whether fresh cream or buttercream works best as the filling. I prefer fresh cream over buttercream, but we'll get into the variations a little bit later. Before we begin the actual cake recipe, we need to discuss the ingredient of self-raising flour. It seems to be a more common thing in British and Irish baking, whereas in the States, the leavening ingredients are usually added separately. You'll notice in both of the cakes in this video, there's the addition of baking powder. It helps give it that extra little boost to keep the cake lighter, therefore spongier. Most people in the States also do not use self-raising flour enough to justify buying yet another bag of ingredients that they'll only use occasionally. That's why I choose to make it in small batches myself. All of the separate ingredients are ones that I keep on hand regularly. You will find the base recipe in the description below. The way this particular sponge works is as follows. There are not set ingredient amounts, meaning that the weight of your ingredients are based on the weight of the 5 eggs with their shells. Therefore, if your 5 eggs weigh 280 grams, you will use 280 grams of unsalted butter at room temperature, 280 grams of granulated sugar, and 280 grams of self-raising flour. Also added into this recipe are 20 milliliters of rosewater and 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder. The next step is greasing and flouring the pans. I prefer to take whatever paper is left over from the butter and use it to coat the insides of the pans. Then I take a wee bit of flour, dust the inside of one pan, and then dust the inside of the other. For the first sponge, all the ingredients are added to the bowl and mixed together. Then we take a spoon, lift some of the batter up. If it doesn't fall easily from the spoon, you can add a little bit of milk to loosen up the batter. Once again, the batter should just fall freely from the spoon. The batter is then split between two pans and spread out with an offset spatula. The cakes are baked at 180 degrees Celsius or 350 degrees Fahrenheit. When tested with a toothpick and it comes out clean, the cakes are done. For this first cake, we used homemade fresh raspberry jam and freshly whipped cream. Sandwich the cake together with the other layer of sponge and dust liberally with icing sugar. I also find that if you chill the cake, it firms up the cream nicely and makes the cake cut a lot easier. Now let's take a look at the second version of our sponge cake. Once again, we'll use the 5 eggs and the equal amount in weight of the other main ingredients. However, this time we'll use vanilla extract as our flavoring ingredient. We first begin by creaming together the butter, the sugar and the vanilla, then adding the eggs one at a time. We then mix the baking powder and the self-raising flour together. The flour is folded in and the cake is baked at 180 degrees Celsius or 350 degrees Fahrenheit. This time for a variation, we used homemade mulberry jam and whipped cream. Now we get to compare and contrast the differences between our two sponges, not just in taste, but in texture as well. The first is the all-in-one technique with homemade raspberry preserves. The second is with creaming the unsalted butter and granulated sugar. The eggs are added one at a time. Finally, the flour is folded in. This cake has the homemade mulberry preserves and also with whipped cream. This one's definitely a bit taller in height. However, it has a great texture for a sponge, and visually, it does not seem that much lighter than the first cake that we made. Once again, a nice, light, moist sponge. The hint of rosewater is a nice balance to the raspberry preserves. So there it is, Victoria Sponge, the perfect accompaniment to any afternoon tea. What say you, Mary Berry? Cheers, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.